It happened one Halloween night when I was in 8th grade, and it still chills me to the bone. My best friend Jamie and I had a sleepover planned. We were two horror movie buffs who thought Halloween was the perfect time for a marathon. We set up blankets, popcorn, and dimmed the lights in my living room, excited to get scared out of our minds. Around midnight, after watching The Pit and The Pendulum, Jamie suggested we take the scares to another level with the Ouija board her older brother had given her. I was hesitant, but Jamie was insistent. We set it up on the coffee table, a chill running down my spine the moment our fingers touched the planchette. We started asking basic questions at first. Is anyone here? What's your name? The board was still, and I remember sighing in relief. But then, Jamie asked, "Are you good or evil?" The planchette moved, spelling EVIL. I thought Jamie was messing with me, but her face was pale, and I knew she wasn't joking. The planchette continued, spelling TOM. Tom. The name felt strange, heavy, and I remember a sinking feeling in my stomach. I looked at Jamie, and she looked at me, but we were both frozen, too afraid to stop. Then the planchette started moving on its own, faster, erratic. Neither of us was touching it. Out of nowhere, Jamie's nose started bleeding. It wasn't a small trickle either. It was gushing, running down her chin, staining her shirt. She looked terrified, like she didn't even know what was happening. That's when I knew something was horribly, horribly wrong. We stopped, practically throwing the board across the room. I scrambled to find tissues for Jamie as she clamped her nose, trying to stop the bleeding. The room felt colder, heavier, and I swear I felt ice on us. After that, we didn't say a word. We just went to bed, hoping morning would chase away whatever had entered my home. But it didn't end there. After that night, strange things started happening in my room. Little porcelain statuettes that my grandma had given me would be moved. I'd put them back, and the next morning they'd be somewhere else, facing odd directions like they were looking at me. I would wake up with scratches on my arms and legs, as if I'd been clawed by something. My mum thought I was scratching myself in my sleep, but I knew I wasn't. I started feeling like I was being watched all the time, especially at night. It was like there was something in the corner lurking, waiting. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my mom everything, even though I was terrified she wouldn't believe me. She surprised me by taking it seriously. She went into my room, picked up the Ouija board, and told me she'd burn it. I felt a weight lift off me as soon as she said it. Things settled down after that. The strange occurrences stopped, the scratches went away, and I was finally able to sleep through the night again. But I never forgot that night, and never touched a Ouija board again. I thought that would be the end of it. Then, about 15 years later, I was working at a new job, and a coworker mentioned she had a Ouija board. I warned her about using it, told her what had happened when I was younger, and then just for fun, I said, "Ask it about Tom and Jamie." She looked at me and agreed to try it out, half joking. The next day, she came back to me, looking pale as a ghost. She told me she'd asked the board about Tom and Jamie. The planchette had spelled out Jamie's name correctly. I hadn't mentioned my friend's name to her before. There was no way she could have known. My heart stopped when she told me. She asked if I wanted to know anything else, but I shook my head. I didn't need to. I knew the spirit of Tom was still out there somewhere, and I wanted no part of it ever again. Since that day, I avoid talking about the incident altogether. Every time I see or hear about Ouija boards, I get a sick feeling in my stomach. Like Tom is somewhere, listening, waiting, ready to come back. This was more than a game, more than a Halloween dare. Tom was real, and he hasn't forgotten.
I don't know what made us bring out the Ouija board that day. We were just little kids, me around 6 or 7, and my brother barely 4 or 5. Our mother was with us, standing watchfully in the corner of our small, dimly lit kitchen as we set the board on the kitchen table, thinking it was just a fun game. To us, the Ouija board was like a magical toy. Nobody told us about the dangers it supposedly carried. Back then, it was sold alongside board games, advertised as harmless family fun. We barely even knew how to read and spell, yet we placed our tiny fingers on the planchette, ready to ask questions. I remember our mother's voice, hesitant and almost amused as she read out the letters it spelled. We started asking questions about our ancestors, just simple, childlike questions. Then the board spelled out something that caught her attention, making her expression shift. The board spelled out the name Stuart. We were too young to know what that meant, but our mother's face had changed, turning pale. She asked in a whisper if we were connected to the Scottish royal clan of Stuarts. The board answered yes. It didn't feel like a game anymore. My brother and I looked at each other, the childish laughter dying on our lips. Our mother, usually calm and collected, was now visibly shaken. She started to question the board in a lower voice, asking who it was. The planchette moved faster than before, spelling out that it was coming to visit us. It described a journey, almost as if it were drawing closer and closer to our home. Our mother stood frozen, her face a mask of horror, as the board finally spelled out, "Here." A cold chill ran down my spine. We all looked at each other, not knowing if this was still just a game or something far worse. Just then, we heard a loud clattering noise down the hallway toward the bedrooms. It was as if something or someone was crashing through our house, moving swiftly down the hall, knocking things over, coming closer to where we were in the kitchen. Our mother's hand shot to her mouth, stifling a scream. She grabbed us both, pulling us away from the table. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. But none of us dared to move toward the hallway where the noises were coming from. The noises grew louder, now sounding like footsteps, pacing back and forth in the shadows. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each thump matching the relentless thuds echoing down the hallway. Our mother finally worked up the courage, grabbing the Ouija board with trembling hands, her fingers white-knuckled. Without a word, she stormed outside, pulling us along with her, and tossed the board into the trash. As soon as the board hit the trash, the noises stopped. The house fell silent. We stood outside, shivering in the chilly evening, staring back at the darkened windows of our home, half expecting to see something staring back at us. My brother whimpered, and I reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. The feeling of fear was raw and real. None of us spoke, each too afraid to acknowledge what we had just experienced. That night, we didn't sleep. Our mother stayed with us in the living room, her gaze fixed on the hallway as if daring whatever it was to show itself again. But the silence remained. The next morning, she made sure the board was taken away with the trash. We never spoke of that night again, but every now and then I'd hear something moving in the hallway when I was alone, something that didn't belong. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like something's there, just out of sight, watching and waiting. I'll always remember that night, and I'll always remember the sound of footsteps coming closer.
In 2013, I was staying with my friend Sarah at her place, a remote house in the middle of nowhere, about a 45-minute drive from the nearest store. There wasn't much to do out there. So after hours of movie marathons, boredom began to creep in. That's when we got an idea. Sarah's boyfriend Jake and his friend had come over, and together we decided to make our own Ouija board. It was supposed to be harmless fun. We were so wrong. A week before the Ouija night, I'd experienced something that I hadn't told anyone yet. I'd woken up at exactly 6 a.m. to the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway toward our bedroom. My heart raced as each step grew louder, closer. I nudged Sarah to wake her up, but she just lay there, sound asleep. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I held my breath, waiting for it to open, but nothing happened. That morning, when Sarah finally woke up, I told her about the footsteps. To my shock, she said she'd been hearing those same footsteps for years, always stopping just outside her bedroom. I felt chills race down my spine. All this time, she'd just gotten used to them, dismissing it as something she couldn't explain. And until now, no one else had ever heard them. That night, we settled down in Sarah's living room with the Ouija board, candles flickering around us as we focused on the planchette. We were just messing around, asking questions and laughing at the silence. Nothing seemed to be happening, until we all heard it. A loud, unmistakable bang came from somewhere in the back of the house. Every hair on my body stood up as silence filled the room once again. We decided to stop the session immediately. Everyone agreed it was too creepy to continue. Jake and his friend offered to drive me and Sarah back to my house, but Sarah decided she'd take them home first, leaving me alone in her house. She promised it would be quick, but I was left sitting in the empty living room, listening to every creak and groan of the house. To distract myself, I turned on the television, hoping the sound would help ease my nerves. The opening credits of a movie began to roll, and I started to relax slightly. But then, out of nowhere, the screen froze, and an unbearable buzzing noise filled the room. I tried to change the channel, turn it off. Nothing worked. The buzzing grew louder until it filled my ears. Panicked, I yanked the plug from the wall. The screen should have gone black, but it stayed frozen on that same haunting image, the buzzing now distorted and echoing around the empty room. I felt like I was going to scream. I ran outside, hoping the fresh air would calm me down, but my hands were already shaking, and I couldn't stop the tears from coming. I texted Sarah, desperately asking her to come back right away, explaining everything that had just happened. I tried to calm myself down, but that's when the dogs started going insane. They were snarling, barking viciously, staring at the living room door like they could see something I couldn't. I backed away, heart pounding as I kept my eyes on that door, terrified of what might come through it. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sarah returned. I could hear the buzzing from the television still blaring from inside, even as I met her on the porch, breathless and trembling. We entered the house together and the TV was off, completely silent. It was still unplugged. We looked at each other, neither of us able to explain what had just happened, but we both knew something unnatural was lurking in that house. We didn't sleep that night. Sarah and I stayed huddled together, lights on, waiting for morning. Neither of us could shake the feeling that something had been summoned that night. To this day, we still talk about it, but every time we remember, a sense of dread returns. We're both convinced that whatever made those footsteps froze the TV and terrified the dogs was not of this world.
Back in the early 80s, things seemed simpler, but sometimes simplicity only hid things lurking beneath the surface. Paul and I had been close friends for years, bound by shared experiences and countless memories. But that night, something was different from the very start. Paul lived in a quiet apartment complex, with buildings nestled close together and all the comforting familiarity that a close-knit neighborhood brings. The night was clear and stars blanketed the sky, yet there was a strange stillness in the air, an eerie silence that seemed to hang over everything. We decided to walk over to our friend Jim's place, just a few buildings away. The walk should have felt routine, even mundane, but as soon as we stepped outside, an unsettling feeling crept over both of us. It was as if the night was hiding something, watching, waiting. "Do you feel that?" Paul asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, not wanting to admit the knot of anxiety coiling in my stomach. We both felt it, a creeping sense of being watched by something unseen and unnatural. When we got to Jim's apartment, the door was unlocked and we walked right in. Jim and his friends were gathered in the dimly lit living room, huddled around an object on the table, a Ouija board. They didn't seem fazed, laughing and chatting, but Paul and I couldn't shake the sense that something had seeped into the room. Jim grinned as we entered, inviting us to join. "Come on, it's harmless," he said, but Paul and I exchanged a look that said everything. This wasn't harmless. Something in the air felt thick and wrong, almost like we were intruding on something ancient and malicious. We watched as they moved the planchette across the board, asking questions that echoed in the dim room. And then, out of nowhere, Paul whispered, "We shouldn't be here. I don't know why, but we have to leave." A chill shot down my spine, and I nodded, feeling the same urge. We left abruptly, stepping into the cold night air, and for a second I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as we made our way back to Paul's place, that feeling returned, more intense this time, like something was following us, something dark and invisible. The air around us felt charged, like static electricity before a storm, and each step made the feeling worse. I felt a weight at my back, as if something were breathing down my neck, just out of sight. Paul looked pale, his eyes darting around, searching the shadows. We picked up our pace, but no matter how fast we walked, the presence felt closer, as if it were drawing energy from our fear. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and with each passing second, the urge to run grew stronger. Then Paul stopped abruptly and grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I listened, and in the stillness there was a faint sound, a whisper, like wind brushing against a window, but somehow wrong. We both stood there, frozen, and that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, the whisper grew louder, more intense, and I swear it almost sounded like my own name. My legs went numb with fear, and I grabbed Paul's arm, pulling him forward. "Run!" We sprinted, feet pounding against the pavement, but no matter how fast we ran, the sense of something lurking right behind us never left. The shadows around us seemed to shift, and I couldn't shake the feeling that any second something would reach out from the darkness. We reached Paul's apartment, fumbling with the keys in panic. I could feel something closing in, a suffocating, malevolent presence pressing closer as Paul finally managed to unlock the door. The moment we slammed the door shut, a silence fell over us. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was thick, like the calm before a storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had followed us was still lurking just beyond the door. Paul looked at me, his face as pale as a ghost. "Did you feel it too?" he whispered. I nodded, too shaken to speak, and we both stood there listening, half expecting to hear that whisper again. Hours passed, but the feeling lingered, a heavy dread that wouldn't lift. And though we tried to brush it off, neither of us could shake the feeling that something had latched onto us that night, something we hadn't seen, but had definitely felt.
I had always been fascinated by the paranormal, though I kept it to myself. Last year, I went to a friend's house party. The night was supposed to be carefree. Just a bunch of college friends catching up and having fun. Around 1 in the morning, someone thought it would be fun to pull out a Ouija board. I felt an immediate chill run down my spine. I tried to laugh it off with them, but I was the only one genuinely worried about it. They started asking simple questions, moving the planchette around as if they were calling some spirit up from a forgotten grave. I sat there, trying to act like it was all a joke, but my heart was pounding. Then someone asked if the spirit wanted to hurt any of us. I could have sworn the room's temperature dropped. And then, in what felt like slow motion, the planchette moved to spell only one. The next question came naturally, even though every fiber of my being screamed not to ask. Who? The board spelled out my full name. Natasha. I hadn't gone by my full name in years. They all called me Tasha. I got up and left the room, shaken, but the others kept playing, ignoring the rule that you must say goodbye to the spirit before leaving the board. Later that night, I felt a terrible migraine coming on, followed by a nosebleed. I barely remember the rest, but my friends recorded me acting like I was possessed. According to the videos, my voice changed. They said I spoke in strange languages. I was told that my eyes went completely blank and my movements were stiff and unnatural. This wasn't just a one-time event. My parents later told me that I'd been acting the same way at home for days after that night. One night, I woke up with my hands around my own neck, as if I was trying to choke myself. I didn't remember how it happened. My parents would find me talking to myself in the dark, speaking in a voice that didn't sound like mine. And still, I remembered none of it. 2 weeks later, the nightmares started to fade, and I felt like myself again. But then, suddenly, I felt a pain in my kidneys, so intense that it landed me in the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain it. They scheduled me for surgery, but the pain disappeared the morning I was supposed to go under. Since then, I have never truly felt alone. Sometimes it feels like someone is holding my hands or grabbing my neck, making it hard to breathe. I'm left wondering if that night changed me somehow, or if maybe I brought something back from the other side. I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain. I'll never go near a Ouija board again. When I was a teenager, spending the weekends at my grandma's place was always something I looked forward to. Her house was this charmingly old place with creaky floors, filled with photos of family and a lot of antique furniture. I always felt a kind of warmth in that house, except when she'd bring out the Ouija board. Not a real one, just a homemade one. A sheet of paper and an old CD served as our portal. I never understood why my grandma wanted to do this, but she insisted it was a way to connect with my uncle, her son. At first, it was harmless, more like a game to me. I'd put my fingers on the CD and we'd ask questions. When my grandma did it, nothing ever happened. But for me, the CD would start to move, slowly spelling out answers. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The responses were simple, innocent, like you'd expect from a child. The atmosphere changed gradually, though, in ways that were hard to describe. The once playful spirit seemed to grow more intense. I felt like I was no longer alone, even when Grandma stepped out of the room. One night, as I asked the usual questions, the CD slid aggressively across the paper, spelling out, "No." I froze, feeling the weight of something watching. When I asked if it was still my uncle, there was a pause. Then the CD spelled, "Not Your uncle. My heart pounded as a cold chill crept down my spine. This wasn't a game anymore. The room felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. It told me it had my uncle and was coming for me next. Before I could react, a strange feeling overtook me, like my head was filling with static. My vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping. The next thing I knew, I had blacked out. It couldn't have been for more than a few seconds, but when I came to, the light bulb above us exploded, sending glass flying. My grandma looked horrified. "We need to stop this," she said, but I could barely process what was happening. That feeling, that dark, suffocating presence, was still in the room. I felt its weight pressing down on my shoulders, like a pair of invisible hands pinning me to my seat. As I tried to shake off the haze, the entity continued to communicate, telling me things about myself that it shouldn't know. Deep secrets, fears, things I'd never spoken out loud. It mocked me, taunted me, saying it had been watching for a long time. My grandma prayed quietly beside me, her hands trembling. "This was a mistake," she kept saying, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt a surge of anger coming from the board, as though the spirit was furious at her words. And the CD shot across the table, stopping abruptly. I didn't want to be in that room anymore. I told my grandma I was done, that I'd never use the board again. But the entity wasn't done with me. "Burn it," it spelled. But then the letters rearranged, spelling "burn you." My heart pounded as the air grew cold around us, yet I felt sweat trickling down my face. My hands shook as I grabbed the board and CD, storming to the backyard where I set them on fire. The flames roared higher than they should have for a piece of paper and a plastic disc, and I thought I saw a face in the smoke, grinning as it twisted and disappeared into the night. From that day on, the house didn't feel the same. I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hear faint whispers when no one was around. I swore I saw someone standing at the end of my bed one night, a shadow with hollow eyes watching me sleep. I started having terrible dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like something was choking me. One night, I woke up with deep scratch marks on my arm that I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching, waiting for its chance. That was the last time I ever touched a Ouija board. The experience left a scar that I carried with me for years. Even now, I feel like I'm being watched, like that entity is still lurking, waiting for me to slip up and invite it back into my life. I don't go near anything remotely occult anymore. Looking back, I wish I had never agreed to play. I wish I could tell others to never touch those things, no matter how innocent they may seem. You never know what might be on the other side, waiting. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting content. If you have your own terrifying experiences, send them in, and maybe you'll hear your story next. Until then, stay safe, and remember, some stories are better left alone. See you in the next video. Bye.